Hello everyone, welcome to my talk, MITRE ATT&CK, combining APTs, TTPs, and GRC to build a realistic security program. Out of show of hands, is everyone here familiar with ATT&CK or have at least heard of it? A couple people, awesome. So it's definitely become a buzzword, unfortunately, in our community, and more on that just a little bit later. But really my goal here, and what we're trying to get at, is how you can actually leverage this framework and actually integrate it and how to get buy-in from management, especially since they most likely have a GRC program that they're following. A little bit about myself. I'm a senior penetration tester at Wolf & Company. I've been at the firm for a little over 4 years now. I'm also a first-time speaker and a first-time attendee at a BSides, so I'm really excited and humbled to be a speaker here. If you have constructive, thank you. If you have any constructive criticism, feedback, I'm still relatively new to public speaking. I welcome it, so ping me on Twitter, email me, whatever works. I also just left a note that my transition started really with IT audit, so I actually have experience with reviewing security frameworks such as CIS Top 18, well, previously Top 20, NIST CSF, and really getting into the weeds of actually reviewing and understanding Active Directory. I'm going to try and convince you, especially if you're an offensive security member or kind of on the more of the purple team side of the house, that you're most likely also an auditor or QA type of person, and I'll try to convince you and get buy-in from that. Even if you aren't a third party or kind of doing consulting services, you can take the audit principles and incorporate them into your actual company. My Twitter and LinkedIn are also there, and I guess a bigger resolution image as well if you are interested. So as an agenda, I'm first going to introduce the MITRE ATT&CK Enterprise Matrix. So that's really the framework that we're talking about. Enterprise, since that's mainly the leading one in terms of where we're actually looking at post-compromise of understanding where these threats are coming from. I'm going to try and motivate, so since we're in a college, I studied mathematics in college. A lot of the times my professors always had to motivate the problem, so I'm going to try and motivate why we want to use ATT&CK and how we can actually incorporate it with GRC. Thinking like an auditor, like I mentioned, I'm going to try and do my best to sell you the idea that you can take these audit principles and incorporate them internally as well, and obviously for the business. Purple teaming and a little bit of threat modeling. There's a lot of talks that are upcoming and also have already talked about threat modeling, so I'm going to let them do probably a much better job at introducing that topic, but I guess a brief primer could be at least useful to understand it. Again, purple teaming, I guess there's a huge disagreement on what that buzzword can also mean, but we'll try and get to that a little bit later as well. I also prayed to the demo gods earlier, so I've been, if you saw me back in the corner just drinking a lot of coffee, eased my nerves a little bit. I do have a live demo to incorporate some of these tools to actually show you how to use them, so hopefully that goes well. And then finally we'll have questions and kind of a QA if there's time, obviously. So again, if you're not familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, we're kind of introducing a new framework to solve these types of issues, right? We have NIST 853, and one of my favorite things to explain to people, if you're not familiar with these governance frameworks like the CIS Top 18, everything kind of maps back out to like old standard. So you have NIST CSF that has a mapping, you have MITRE ATT&CK that has a mapping to NIST 853, you have a mapping to CIS. All these different mappings and frameworks, it can get really overwhelming. And it may be really confusing for me to then say, oh, let's use another framework in your security stack. How much time is that really going to spend, right? But there is value there, and it's not going to be as impossible of a task as you may imagine of trying to lead and explain to the business of, hey, there's this really cool matrix out there. If you're a SOC analyst, you're probably already seeing those indicators like T1003, if something like that comes up in your SIM alerts, hopefully it doesn't, but things like that, you may already get those indications. And using that framework to align to the business is going to be a much longer win in the long term because you can get buy-in from other departments, right? So we oftentimes, especially as security professionals, we get super in the weeds of thinking about MITRE ATT&CK because it's so interesting. There's so much new things to learn about it, and it's always being updated. But if you ask someone in audit or compliance or people who aren't really in the technical roles, they probably never heard of that framework. So it's really important that we have a way to actually explain how we can actually use it, and that's by leveraging what already exists. So if they have to be Prelude compliant, PCI, HIPAA, try to leverage that to your use case to then bring in MITRE ATT&CK. So again, what is the business familiar with? That's really what we're trying to get at. So I have my obligatory pyramid slide as well. If some of you folks are actually familiar, this is how I'm going to motivate the purpose of MITRE ATT&CK as well. On the left, you have David Bianco's Pyramid of Pain. That came out during APT1, and he really motivated this actual issue of understanding where we are at with especially detecting attacks, or how we actually go about defending them. The MITRE ATT&CK framework is really looking at post-compromise, right? So what actions a malicious actor is actually taking inside the network. So we're kind of assuming that post-compromise. And that's important to understand because at the very bottom rung of that pyramid, we have hash values. So that's malicious signatures of a random file. So if I download software that has a SHA hash on it, it's very easy to detect. But it's also trivial for an attacker to change that, right? That's really easy for me to change one line of code. And it's unfortunately common for AV tools to do that, where I'm an offensive-minded person. If I download something from GitHub and all I have to do is change a couple lines from my PowerShell script to no longer get detected, and there are tools like that, Mimikatz, for example. If you remove some of his lines, you can sometimes still execute it, unfortunately. So it's really easier for us as attackers to change that, but also easy for defenders to detect that as well. As you move up, some of them may be more obvious as well. IP addresses, again, as an attacker, easy for me to change, easy to detect. Same with domain names, and kind of getting more and more difficult at the top. At the highest top, though, at least for the left side of the pyramid, we have TTPs, and that's tactic, techniques, and procedures. And you can think of that as behavior-based. It's really difficult to change and influence behavior because we're humans, right? And that's part of an advantage and disadvantage that we have as defenders, because if you think about behaviors, I drink a lot of coffee, so we can think of it as a tactic. I need to get my caffeine in the morning. That's one of my tactics. And then the techniques that I go about that, I have an espresso machine at home, so I brew my own espresso. And maybe my procedure is I first have to get the beans, I have to grind it and actually get the beans into the hopper and make my coffee, right? So we can think of that as a kind of a top level of a tactic of getting caffeine, all the way to the actual procedure of how I'm actually doing and getting coffee. But if you suddenly remove where I'm actually getting my beans or try to influence that, that's kind of where defenders need to step in to try and change that behavior. Because if I don't get my coffee in the morning, I'm probably going to be a little bit more upset or angry, obviously. The right pyramid is a little bit more new. It's from Chris Peacock. He is a detection engineer out of Scythe. There's going to be a lot of references to Scythe because I think they're awesome, and they have a lot of great community resources for understanding how to carry out purple team exercises. But I think this is a really great pyramid to, I guess, showcase the difference between how we originally thought the pyramid of pain and motivating why we use MITRE ATT&CK to then understand how we can actually use that framework. On the bottom, we have tactics, and that's kind of easy for us to understand. But really what we're trying to get at is procedure level data, because that's really king. And unfortunately, in cyber threat intelligence reporting, we don't have a lot of procedure data. So breaches, although we know occur, we don't really ever get the specific details of exactly what an attacker carried out. So did they use proc dump to dump memory from credentials? What exactly did they actually do? And that's really what we're mainly interested from the MITRE ATT&CK framework, because that's really what we can emulate. Because if you think about techniques, right here we say we're dumping LSAS memory, right? But how do we actually do that? How do we emulate that? If we wanted to use a purple team exercise, we'd have to kind of make a guess or an assumption, or rely on the cyber threat intelligence reporting to tell us how we do it. I don't know what's the fascination with pyramids, but it seems like we have a pyramid scheme problem, where at the bottom things are very easy, and then at the top you kind of win a prize or a reward. A weird pyramid scheme problem, but sure. So let's actually get into an overview of what MITRE ATT&CK is. So that enterprise framework can be really overwhelming. So you have 14 different tactics at the top level, so things like initial access, credential access, data exfiltration, impact, and then on the bottom, like I mentioned, you have techniques. So if I'm talking about credential access as a tactic, I may dump credentials from an operating system. I may perform a man-in-the-middle attack. Those are kind of the techniques. And then within those techniques, you then have sub-techniques, and then goes into the specific procedures. That can be really overwhelming, and I'm not even going to showcase the entire matrix right now because it may not even fit into the slide. But that's something to understand. The framework is also based on observable data. So that means that it needs to be in some sort of publicly available cyber threat intelligence reporting to then state that they're actually going to put it in the framework. And that's important because they're really rigorous about that, where it needs to be actually observed. And that's a really important piece of the MITRE ATT&CK framework that sometimes gets misunderstood. So it's really important not to play bingo and saying we're going to cover the whole MITRE ATT&CK framework and make sure we're covered in terms of all these different threat actors, because there's so many different techniques that'll actually occur. We have to really prioritize the ones that we know that are threat actors, or the ones that we care about are actually performing. The second part to that, the observed data, as offensive security-minded people, or at least the people in the room that know about it, is there are oftentimes techniques that are not in the framework, but then suddenly appear. So one that comes to my mind is, if you folks are familiar with Okta, the Okta breach that occurred with Lapsus, one of the techniques that they actually employed, or the threat actors executed, was they obtained credentials, and then they started logging in kind of interactively against their authenticator. So I think I'm not sure if it was Okta itself, but there was MFA implemented for an end user that they compromised, and they kept on spamming requests. And in that case, they had their soft token on their phone. And the end user just kept on getting bombed on requests. They didn't accept it until suddenly they did. They thought it was some strange authentication attempt that occurred. That wasn't in the MITRE ATT&CK framework, but now it is, right? That's an example of where sometimes there's a delay of us actually receiving novel techniques. But if you ask penetration testers or anyone in the offensive security community, we've known about that for a while, right? We've been doing that, and does it actually make it real, quote unquote, if now MITRE ATT&CK has it in the framework? So that's one caveat to understand, that although it's really rich and there's a lot of data that's in the actual framework that we can leverage to our advantage, it's not going to cover or encompass those novel nuanced techniques that occur. And then we also have to understand the ones that we actually care about. We can't go around and just start filling in the matrix. So how do we actually create a plan that we can think about how we want to bring this into our organization, right? Really the key here is that we want to become auditors, or think like auditors in our organization. So if we know that we have MITRE ATT&CK as a framework, and some of our tooling, if it's a SIM or anything like that, or EDR, it's most likely already reporting or aligning to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, whether you realize it or not. What we're trying to do is first build out the threat model that actually matters to us. So ransomware is a really easy one to kind of think about because they don't discriminate the targets. Not the most sophisticated types of techniques that are employed, and pretty easy to start there. So if you don't even know how to perform threat modeling or kind of where to begin, ransomware is a pretty obvious group or place to start. Then we have to identify the actual security controls that we're actually interested in testing. So if we're looking at this in totality, we're looking at this post-compromise. So we already have access to an endpoint most likely. Are we examining EDR? Do we have a SIM? Do we have Sysmon integrated under our endpoints? Do we have any other controls that will be actually in scope of our actual testing? And then we have to validate the controls. I think for us as information security, we have one of the only unique problems in the field, or one of them, in terms of where we buy a tool or we buy this new fancy tool and we have no idea that it actually works until post-breach, right? I buy EDR or CrowdStrike or SentinelOne, and 2 weeks ago a client told me what they marketed or tried to sell them on is that their tool is going to stop ransomware 100%, right? It's 100% going to stop ransomware. And some people are laughing right now because that's an obvious, it's a great marketing trick, but it's never going to be actually reality because we know that's actually not happening, right? You can't just implement a silver bullet in information security and expect perfection. And in that sense that we have to then, since we have these tools, we have to essentially audit and measure them, right? We can't just implement them and forget. So that's kind of the proactive approach that we're trying to align to, of leveraging the MITRE ATT&CK framework and bringing it into the organization. And it's a challenge because some people just don't know that. They're being sold EDR or they have this new SIM, and then they have this technical debt that occurs where they're just integrating all these fancy tools but never really get a chance to actually measure or test how they're actually operating until a breach occurs. But don't take it from me, right? So that is just a really high level of what we're going to get to through this talk, but there's great resources available. So Scythe, their community blog, and they released the Purple Team exercise framework. So if you're really interested in actually getting into the weeds of thinking about how to be an operator and how to coordinate these types of exercises, that's a really great place to start. From a reporting perspective, Defensive Origins, they have Atomic Purple Team, and that's one of the examples of the playbooks that they have, where you can have this life cycle of a specific threat model that you're looking to emulate. So imagine ransomware is the one I mentioned. Conti, which we'll get to in terms of how we can emulate them. They're a threat actor or ransomware as a service affiliate group that offers their software to these ransomware operators and they encrypt networks, right? If we're looking at specifically to emulate what Conti does and the stages of discovery as a tactic, we can look at and examine their actual playbook, and those are the techniques and the procedure level data that we have of what Conti actually does in the network, and have these different types of exercises that we perform internally. That way we can go to management, and this is kind of speaking more towards the business, rather than saying, hey, we're going to assume compromise or there's going to be a breach happening. We can't do anything about it. Instead we say, we heard Conti in the news, you've heard about dark side in the news to the business, especially executives. This is the steps that we've taken to ensure that our controls are actually able to defend or detect against it. And that's really important because I was in Wild West Hack and Fest, so this is actually credit to the panel that occurred a couple of weeks ago. And Alyssa Miller is a BSO, and she actually made a really good point that actually struck me, because a lot of times with us, when we're explaining concepts of trying to ensure that people understand why we look at assumed breach, right? Why are we actually looking to test post-compromise? We often say, oh, you're going to get breached. So we have to just, you're going to get breached, so you have to make that assumption. But if you think about it from the executive or business side, that's not really the best sell, right? That's telling people that they're going to get breached, then why are you hired, or what are you doing for your job? That's not really a great sell. So instead, it's shifting it away and saying we're going to emulate this, or the reason why we're doing these types of exercises is because we're being proactive with the threat rather than saying we're going to get breached and we can't do anything about it. I just thought that was really funny because I've definitely said that before. I've told clients like, oh, you're most likely going to get, it's a matter of when you get breached, not if, right? We always kind of say that, but that's a really poor job of selling why we actually do post-compromise testing as a whole. So if you still don't believe me, on the right side, I have an excerpt from the FDIC. Hopefully not many of you in this room or anyone watching has to deal with them, but they have this awesome resource if you want to dive in on a Saturday night regarding model validation. And it's kind of funny, but that's similarly in terms of what we're actually looking to do internally, right? If we have EDR or our SIM, we're looking to validate that model of the data that's being inputted is actually going to get an output that we're looking for. So if I emulate that procedure again of dumping credentials from memory, I'm hoping that the output is either, well, hopefully it gets blocked, but if it doesn't, at least it gets logged in telemetry, and then it also executes an alert. And that's essentially what we're looking to do. We're looking to create those accurate, repeatable, and complete tests. So I'll repeat that again because it's important. That's a key audit principle that you should know. Is that auditors love things that are testable, repeatable, and they're complete. Right? That's what we're looking to perform. And that's essentially those types of test scripts that we're actually looking to perform. And most likely your audit department, especially if you're in a bank like BSA audits, or if you're in a heavily regulated industry, most likely other departments already have to deal with that. SOX reporting of reviewing user lists between a termination sheet, they have to do that and ensure that the system is actually reporting like it's intended to. That's their model. And in some ways, in what I think is going to happen, information security has the same problem. We just haven't really translated that fully or captured that intent. But we're really validating models when we actually perform these types of exercises, whether it be from a pen test, where we're looking to validate different types of attack paths, or it's within this type of purple teaming atomic level testing, which we'll get to. But it's really important to make attack appealing, because if I just showed you the entire matrix and I tried to showcase, hey, we're going to use this framework now to a member of compliance or audit, it's going to be really overwhelming for them. So instead, we'll just use their same language. So if you, like I said, are in a banking space or financial institution, it's really easy to sell to the audit or compliance team that's already doing model validation and explain to them how your system is actually a model. Your SIM is actually a model that you're looking to validate. And then you get buy-in from management to then start performing these types of exercises. Or if you just have your own security program internally and you want to start actually emulating these actions, if you have the NIST CSF and your information security officer is working on policies and procedures for actually making the NIST CSF or CIS controls, and they need some sort of backing of, we have this critical gap, right? We know that we have this gap in our tooling. We can create an exercise or a life cycle type of an assessment where we assess our controls and say we have this critical gap. We don't have, we don't have this awesome EDR tool that would help mitigate this, and we can get buy-in from executives and boards by using ATT&CK. So I mentioned procedure level data as being really important for the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and you could really refer to that as atomic testing. And that's commonly referred to an atomic, meaning it's one single action that an adversary may take in a network. So if I'm in a compromised endpoint or I have access to an endpoint, a single action that I may take is enumerate users. So how would I go about doing that? And that could be done through net users, basic commands on the Windows operating system, kind of living off the land. That's one adversarial action, and it's as simple as just thinking that. That's one test case right there that we have that we can emulate in our networks. In that atomic testing, it's really important to be accurate though. You can't unfortunately just open a PowerShell and just do net users and then expect an alert from your EDR. Your EDR should probably get the telemetry from that, but really what we're looking to do is chain these different types of atomic sets, where the second I start doing net users, and then I dump the password policy, and I'm starting to do a password attack or a password spray internally. That level of change where we're linking those different types of procedures or atomics, where we have that actionable objective of what that adversary is actually looking to do. They're trying to get credentials in that case. That's where some security controls with enough telemetry should either take action to prevent it or detect it. Back in April or early April, is anyone here familiar with attack evaluations for MITRE Ingenuity? So a couple of people. So every year, it's amazing, but we've somehow convinced our EDR vendors and SIM tool, or anyone that's essentially making EDR, was convinced to come in and perform an annual exercise that's held by MITRE Ingenuity. And what they do is essentially what I'm describing, right? There's a threat model or a plan that's proposed by MITRE Ingenuity team. They have two threat actors. The most recent one this year was Wizard Spider, which is a ransomware actor, and Sandworm, I think also, that's actually FSB or GRU for a Russian actor. And what they do is essentially they tell each vendor that, hey, we're going to test and validate your actual tooling is working as intended, and this kind of live exercise format where all we're going to tell you about Wizard Spider is these are the techniques, come with your tool. They don't tell them the procedure level data of exactly what they're executing. They just tell the vendors, hey, we're going to execute these types of techniques against the Wizard Spider threat group of what we actually know, the observed data that we talked about. And unfortunately, MITRE Ingenuity does nothing to state of the efficacy of the results. They just kind of showcase the results. And if we have time, I'll kind of show what that actually looks like. But that's a really powerful resource where if you don't even know where to start of where am I supposed to even emulate adversaries or how do I do this internally, this is all public information where you can not only look up the emulation plan, you could look up the exact procedures. So I'm not sure if that comes out really well. They could see the exact procedures that they executed for each of the assessments. And then you can also see any of the configuration changes that the EDR vendor actually did. So if we're looking at the comparison between CrowdStrike or Microsoft, and not to say one is better than the other, but more so of if I'm looking to either purchase an EDR or understand where my gaps are, you can look at the results as a whole, where it shows the screenshots of the outcome. You can show the configuration changes, like I said, and that's all public information. So if you're interested in at least looking at that and saying, how did CrowdStrike do? You could take it and see what they changed with their config and then implement it internally as well. That's really powerful information. However, it's become like another cheap marketing trick where, like I mentioned before, a client told me that a vendor told them 100% of the ransomware will be blocked. Very similar, we had on Twitter, everyone saying that they are 100% MITRE ATT&CK aligned, they prevent and detect everything. And it's still, I was going to put the Twitter post up there, but I don't want to discriminate on vendors. It's a really good marketing play. But that's one thing to understand, that we're not looking to be 100% preventative or detective. That's not really the objective of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. We're looking to create these test cases of this atomic level of testing and emulate and ensure that our controls are actually working as intended. Yeah, so on the bottom, you can see kind of an emulation plan, and this, again, this is all public information that you can even look up on the GitHub. So again, if I'm looking at this a very naive approach of understanding how we can do threat modeling, quote unquote, or what should I actually care about, I can go straight to the MITRE ATT&CK enterprise matrix, and I can perform a search on their search bar. Unfortunately, it takes a little bit, but if you search up, like, for example, I'm a hospital. I can search up the groups that target hospitals and just start automatically learning what the actual techniques that they actually execute and bring that as an emulation plan. So in this case, I looked up who targets hospitals just by looking up the keyword, and on the bottom you'll see what's highlighted as a group Wizard Spider. That's the one that the adversary emulation plan for MITRE Ingenuity they tested, and I can use, I can start understanding the techniques that they use and mapping that out in my plan as well. So pretty trivial and easy way to kind of get started, at least, especially if you don't have the resources of a massive CTI tool or team that's investigating actual threats, right? Like if we're just starting as one person, we could just kind of take this. And it could be as simple as going on Twitter, or it could be as simple as anything you heard on the news and understanding, hey, this is what we're going to start emulating, and this is the reason why, because it's affecting our industry. This is kind of quick, but in terms of that group, so I just focus on the Wizard Spider. MITRE ATT&CK also has something, an application on the web called Navigator, which allows you to then kind of visualize and highlight different techniques that are actually occurring in each group. So in this case, for Wizard Spider, I zoomed in really closely, but this is what gets highlighted, meaning that Wizard Spider actually was observed performing this. So they use valid accounts. And again, this may be really high level, but that may be confusing in terms of what does that actually mean. There's citations, at least, to showcase where the actual data actually comes from. And hopefully in that data, I can at least look and see what the actual procedure was in terms of what they actually mean by valid accounts. Did they get a credential? Did they guess a credential? And that way I can bring it into my emulation plan. So that atomic unit of testing, it's really important to also keep your plan simple. It's really enticing and exciting to just try 20 different techniques at once in your network, or one of the endpoints that you're targeting, because it's really flashy and interesting, but that can cause a lot of issues, right? Like you want to start simple and make sure you understand how a lifecycle can actually occur. And most likely, unfortunately, you're going to be hit with a dose of reality, meaning that your tools are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. Or maybe you had these initial assumptions, because that's really what this is looking to do. We're looking to validate your types of assumptions that you have of your control environment. I have EDR, so maybe I'm assuming that it's going to pick up a lot of Windows binaries or PowerShell. Hint, it's not. Or B, you may have this new logging tool that's supposedly working well, it's on every endpoint, and it's going to pick up every technique. It's most likely not going to. So you have to really frame your assumptions correctly, and then also keep your emulation plan simple, so that way you can achieve success. If you still don't know where to start, there's Red Canary creates a detection report every year of the top techniques. There's a top 10. Prelude is a company that we'll get to and try to showcase a little bit. They have something called TTP Tuesday, which they release different attack chains. And then SICE also has Threat Thursday, where they also showcase simulation plans. And that includes publicly available procedure data. So that's getting really into specifics of what actors are actually doing. So this is a kind of blown up image, and why I try not to showcase too much of it, but this is the enterprise matrix and how we can overlay different types of threats that we're actually concerned about. So this is looking at Advanced Persistent Threat 28, which is the fancy bear one, to APT 29. And you can kind of get this joining of what actual threats are being used, or techniques are actually employed by both threat actors. So maybe that's one way to actually prioritize where we should actually focus our defensive measures, right? So we're looking at execution, that's green, so that's actually being that one technique of exploitation for client execution. That's one that's both actors are doing, and that's maybe one I care more about than another one. So how is this all made, though, in terms of where does MITRE ATT&CK actually come with this information? This is a public document that's available on MITRE ATT&CK as well, that was performed by Cyberreason. But they took cyber threat intelligence and they essentially started mapping different techniques from a report. So like I mentioned, this is all observed data. So if there's a report of a breach and there's procedure, or at least enough detail for us to start mapping back to attack, this is where that comes from. So in this case, we're looking at the very early stages of an attack, of how they actually got initial access. So they use a spear phishing link, they use an attachment with word macros, and then they delivered it to the endpoint, the client, and executed it, allowing them to get access to the actual host. If you notice, a lot of this is still very high level, right? We sometimes have to still make these assumptions. What kind of macro document did they actually send? Is it publicly available? Is it something we need to create our own? we know that there's an attachment, but it's still not really specific, which makes things sometimes difficult. Other times you get specific instructions of how you can actually emulate adversaries. So Conti was the threat actor that I mentioned earlier. That's a ransomware as a service affiliate group where they offer their tool out to operators that want to deploy ransomware and encrypt networks. In the past year, their playbook was actually released and translated. This, you can download it on GitHub yourself, and it's actually really fascinating because it goes through what they use as Cobalt Strike. So Cobalt Strike is it's a commercial tool for command and control, but in the actual playbook, they actually detail out different steps that an operator, so if someone's using their tool, should take to gain elevated rights, or how they should actually carry out a ransomware campaign. And this is really rich information, right? We can see, okay, they're going to do shell who am I, right? That's on the Cobalt Strike beacon, and they're executing who am I, and that is an example of a technique, that procedure level data that we have that they knew occur. And we can start chaining these different types of atomic testing to then build out our emulation plan. If we have to guess, we can also use a new concept, a relatively new concept called the Tac Flow. So like I mentioned, we don't always have the luxury of having that clear procedure level data that we can use in our actual networks or testing it as an emulation plan. But making assumptions and guessing is still okay. So if folks have read the recent Verizon data breach and incident response report, the DBER report of 2022, you'll see that there's nothing in that report that maps to a TTP. Instead, what they've done is aligned to with MITRE Ingenuity, and that's more in terms of the impact of a breach and less so about how actors actually did their actions or atomic testing. But we can still make those different types of assumptions by creating a Tac Flow. So on the right-hand side, you'll see what I have displayed is an image of what we can consider as a Tac Flow. It's a little bit easier to understand if you have it blown up. But this is actually from the Tesla breach that occurred. And instead of going very specific to the atomic testing, we can still keep it high level and make an emulation plan that's, again, repeatable, it's accurate and complete, based on what actually occurred from threat intelligence, of maybe what we only have. So in this case, at the top, you'll see that Kubernetes was exposed. So that was compromised. That allowed them to start executing commands. And then that, again, elevating the rights or gaining credentials, they could put a cryptocurrency miner on the system. In that attack flow, you could start thinking about ways you can actually emulate, or ask your penetration testers to ensure that they're actually doing something similar. Maybe that's something I really care about, of saying, I have Kubernetes, is it exposed, how can I actually go about testing it? But the end goal is really just to ensure that we have high confidence. We're never gonna get 100% accuracy of a technique. We can't emulate a technique fully. We can only really emulate the procedures. So we only have some confidence variance of between, for this technique, I have pretty high confidence I can stop or detect, versus another one, maybe it's more in the red. Maybe it's unclear if I tested it, or it's never been tested in my environment. Another way you can go about actual prioritization is using MITRE Ingenuity's calculator. So on the right side is their tool to actually, essentially, if you wanted to list out the CIS controls of NIST 853, you can start mapping all your controls that we talked about before. If you know that your organization's using these governance frameworks, you can start mapping this and creating TTPs that are actually really important to test. Maybe it's a top priority. And they go about that by, mainly the key one that I want to talk about is the Chokepoint, because for each technique, it needs to be executed somehow. So a really good example is process injection, where if you want to successfully emulate process injection, you need to first use a command line, either PowerShell or CMD, and you also need to execute that in some sort of different service. And a lot of different atomic tests or procedures are incorporated into just process injection alone. That can include PowerShell execution. They can include a whole load of different types of techniques right there alone. So that's a really high priority type of technique that you may want to detect or prevent. Compared to someone leaving a ransomware note, that's just creating a file, right? There's not many different opportunities of various different techniques that are used to just leave a file on an endpoint. Again, so linking procedures, I just want to touch on it again. The Prelude team, or what we're actually going to showcase, goes into this really well in a blog post. But you should really think about those atomic tests as actions that build up to some sort of attack chain. So if all I do is just emulate impact, so tactic being impact, and one of the objective as a ransomware actor is to leave a ransomware note to showcase that your files are encrypted. If all I do in my endpoint is just show a files there, that's not really giving a fair test to the EDR. And all you're doing is just, okay, we have a file on the network. And it's not really showcasing the full impact of what actually occurred on an endpoint. That's why you want to make sure you want to build up these test cases together in a string of an actual attack chain. So what is an adversary actually doing to then leave a file? Maybe they delete shadow copies on an endpoint so you can't back up a Windows system anymore. And then they start archiving and collecting data, and then they'll leave the ransomware note. That builds up an attack chain that is actually actionable for your tools to actually defend against. So now I'm hoping that all said is I can at least emulate this. I'm gonna start my lab real quick so we can get into some examples. For those that don't know, I'm using the detection lab for this on Snap Labs. This is a really easy way to actually do these test cases. So if you've never done this before or are actually interested in starting, this is going outside of your production network. Obviously, we're just using a lab, but it's a really cheap and easy way to do it, where you can use these templates such as the detection lab that's a community resource and deploy in AWS and get this instant lab kind of built for you, where you have a DC, you have a Windows environment, and you can install any tools. It has internet access, anything you need. You can really start creating these test cases. So this is at a high level what the network diagram can look like. Yes, I'm going to be a little bit malicious. I'm going to put my tools on a DC just for the essence of time and just being able to showcase what we want. So as this loads up, the tool that I'm going to showcase is called Prelude Operator. It's a graphical application that gives you the ability to actually carry out these types of exercises. Some of you may have heard of Atomic Red Team. Atomic Red Team is a really good resource, and that's a really good place to start. But there's a caveat there where Atomic Red Team is really good at testing telemetry, but it kind of fails, or one of the things that you need to understand is that if you execute something on the Atomic Red Team, it may not give you the best outcome, at least for your defensive controls, to actually see what's actually going on. So for an EDR perspective, you may be getting into an unfair or unrealistic scenario, and that's kind of the importance of making sure what you're doing is actually complete and accurate. Because otherwise, if you just run one atomic test, you don't really get the full chain behavior where your EDR would then pick up malicious activity. You may just be executing something, and all your EDR is doing is picking up the telemetry of something happened. However, that being said, Atomic Red Team is a fantastic place to start, especially if you've never done any of these exercises, and that's a great way to at least ensure that your systems or our controls on endpoint are actually picking up that activity. So right here, what Prelude Operator gives you is different types of beacons or agents you can think of them as. I showcased the Cobalt Strike playbook that Conti released, so we can think of this as we have remote access on a system. And we're really thinking about post-compromise. A lot of these techniques require administrative credentials, and to sell the idea that we want admin credentials is really important. So oftentimes we'll run into scenarios where some clients or even people will just say, oh, that would never happen. You need to get admin rights. We've segregated admin rights by giving DA for our admins, and then we have a separate account. Meanwhile, they have DA on their workstations and member servers. So it's a difficult conversation to have, but you need to get them to at least align to the idea that we need to assume post-compromise, mainly for the efficiency of our test cases. Because obviously if I'm going to dump credentials, we can go about first showcasing that my assumption of how we separate the privileges. If I try to dump credentials as a low privilege user, nothing should happen, right? I shouldn't get the credentials dumped. And then that's maybe the first test case, and start building it up as you go if you need that buy-in. But it's really important that we're actually accurately testing the test case, where if I was able to successfully dump your credentials, you kind of miss that if you don't actually give admin rights to actually emulate that behavior. They have a training platform as well, so if you wanted to go through their introductory CTF of actually how to use the tool, that's available. This is also a community tool, so you can download it tomorrow and get started. It's completely open source and free, the community edition. On the top, if you see it, I have a professional license. It's $50 a month or so, but what that really gives me is the ability to create these attack chains, or leverage the ones that they create every Tuesday to then target an endpoint. But at least to get started, you can certainly start using this completely free. One of the settings, it goes into the actual plugins that they have available. The one that I want to touch on is Vector. Vector is a reporting tool for these types of assessments. So if we're trying to incorporate this completely internally, we may be able to use Vector, for example, to emulate actions using Prelude. So we build up our emulation plan, and we have this life cycle, and we have these fancy reports that get generated for executives, especially if we don't want to showcase exactly the procedure level data of what we did, but maybe we want to showcase at a high level the navigator heat map that we want to showcase. And I'll show that in just a minute. Additionally, for each beacon, you'll see red means that it's dead, meaning I don't actually have access to it. And you can actually use Prelude Operator as an actual C2, where you can set up redirectors where right now, for the sake of demonstration, I just have it directly in my endpoint. But you can actually start making these plans a little bit more accurate and complete. Compared to Atomic Red Team, it's really just focusing on that single isolated test, where you can actually try to emulate C2 behavior, where you have a redirector, you install a beacon or agent on the host, and the agent's actually communicating outbound egress out of your network, where you have an operator view that kind of communicates that midpoint section. Again, so for this profile, you'll see my beacon target's just the local host. So for the sake of demonstration, I do not have a redirector. But here, I can start emulating chains or start executing different atomic tests. I should mention too, for Prelude Operator, they have integrated the Atomic Red Team in the past. They've been trying to figure out ways to actually incorporate that library into it. So if you, we'll see one of the techniques. So I keep on talking about T1003. I can search by technique, right? So T1003 at the very top is what I'm looking for. I'm going to say I'm going to dump the NTDS database because this is a DC. In yellow, it means it's a community resource. And this community resource is actually from Atomic Red Team itself. So this is where they've integrated this test case from Atomic Red Team. But then what's more is I can start building out that kind of realistic scenario where I know a threat actor is going to dump these credentials, but maybe initially they're going to do a lookup for users or enumerate users or something. So get Active Directory users, and I can start building these chains. So you can see that it wants me to save this attack chain, where simply right now, I want to get Active Directory users, so it's going to execute this script on the very bottom. And then the next step, or this atomic step that it's going to execute, is dumping the NTDS dump. Maybe not the most realistic scenario, but just for the sake of demonstration, I can just simply hit deploy. And I get this green little icon of anything that I executed that actually worked. So I get some sort of benefit or assurance that what I actually did worked in the environment or endpoint as intended. If it's red, it'll come back saying that maybe I needed a dependency, I needed to modify a script or add some additional data. I executed some in the beforehand as well. So if I showcase you, for example, that ransomware chain that I talked about, so archiving data and then leaving a ransomware note, we could, for example, list directories in the user's home. And you can see on my lab machine, this is what got executed. That PowerShell command got executed in the chain of listing desktop documents, etc. And then it created a staging directory, meaning that I wanted to emulate the behavior of I listed directories, I'm compiling different files like a ransomware actor would, all occurring from this beacon. So this beacon is executing PowerShell and using these different types of atomics that I've laid out and made for the actual assessment. And then at the very end, it's going to leave an encrypted note. Right? Maybe this is a production system. I don't want to actually encrypt files or do anything, but I'm going to leave a ransomware note to then emulate that chain of activity. I mentioned Vector. So now we can go into the reporting. This tool is automatically plugged in. If I use that plugin Vector, it goes to the API of Vector, which is the reporting tool that I was talking about. And we can start seeing what actually occurred on the system and documenting the actual test cases. So if I, for example, was looking to do Conti initial access, which is a different chain, if I still have it open, I'm not sure if I can find it. If you believe me, for Conti initial access, that's one of the chains I emulated. And we can probably at least run a quick one in the background. So Conti discovery here, for example, is a chain that's already been written. And you can see this is everything that was in the playbook that I showcased a little bit ago of that Conti ransomware affiliate group. And here's all the steps that they may do in an actual network once they actually compromise the system. They'll look for permissions, they'll discover a domain controller, enumerate computers, local users, domains, administrators, who's logged in. They'll try to get some credentials and hashes. I can even showcase the actual views, so the TTP identifiers. TTP, or MITRE ATT&CK actually. If I can hit that. My window's kind of big, so it may not like that what I'm doing. But here's the actual TTPs or techniques that we're emulating, so I can even look before I execute. I get an example of what the commands are actually going to be ran. And I can hit deploy. So I just hit a button, all of a sudden I'm emulating this adversary. So I really care about Conti, and I want to showcase to the business, hey, I don't know how my EDR or SIM is actually going to work. I want to build this test case, and we're going to start first very simple. Just do Conti discovery. It's not going to do their privilege escalation or really impact the system. We're just doing this discovery phase and see how our system actually aligns. Maybe we're trying to build up our defenses a little bit. And if we go back to vector, and this is initial access, so I'll go back to discovery. And you can, if you saw the Prelude stuff come up, that's it, at least communicating to my vector right now via the API. I can see each test case is already laid out for me. And what's more is if I click on one, I can see the operator command that I actually output, or like what it actually did. So this is actual test execution that I performed. It ran cmd.exe-c net local group administrator. So just examining who's in local administrator group. And it's really trivial and simple to understand, right? It's not a complicated 0-day or really malicious binary that got exploited, or we didn't do anything fancy. But this is a huge win right now where we're looking at observed attacker data. We know that this is a chain or direction that attackers are actually executing in the networks. And we can see what the actual outcome is all via the API. So now I get the ability to start tracking actually what occurred in my systems. So maybe nothing happened. I didn't even get detection notice. Maybe I know it was logged in my systems because I have a SIM that's supposed to be doing this. And I can hit save. So that one action, now it gets updated with not detected. I can then finally go into reporting. And you can see I didn't complete everything, right? I didn't go through the entire exercise, but I start getting these graphs that are much easier to understand for management or executives, where I don't have to go into the details of explaining what Conti is, or what procedure we actually ran with CMD, or what actually happened. I can just tell them like, hey, this first emulation plan, we failed. We didn't actually get the detection logic, or we weren't able to prevent the adversary from accomplishing what they're looking to do. But then we retested, and then we got to this end result. So you can kind of showcase a level of history between trends of what actually occurred on the endpoint. My favorite is the heat map, which is going to be somewhat trivial right now, but we can start building a heat map as well in terms of understanding our control environment from, again, that trend data, tracking historical assessments that we perform. So maybe that first time I ran Conti discovery, it went really poorly, and I didn't have my assumptions. My assumptions were completely incorrect. But then I went to my security team and I fixed it, and we have the ability to retest and remediate things. And I come back and have a historical trend between here's things that are red, but here's what we did to fix that. So more of a proactive approach. Does anyone have any questions so far? Go.
This is more a meta question per
Yeah.
se in this case, but when you run multiple procedures on a particular technique, and you can have certain cases where CrowdStrike caught this procedure that falls within, because attack is an abstraction.
Yeah.
So it caught this procedure within this technique, but then we failed like 4 or 5 others that also fall within that technique. How do you or your organization explain that that almost cognitive dissonance there to an executive team to be explained, and also how do you grade that?
Right. So I think the question, and correct me if I'm wrong, is if you create an emulation plan where you have 5 different atomic tests that you're emulating, and maybe one of the 5 only gets caught and detected, and how do you explain to management that there's still more work to be done, where you can't just rely on that sole one test case that would detect it or block? So you have to kind of view in totality, and how do you actually explain that? In my opinion, that's kind of just a conversation with the executives team, and first off with management, to get them aligned with why we're actually executing this, and making sure that those test cases they're performing align to a specific attack chain. So if I just haphazardly just choose random techniques, and then they say, oh, I blocked you here or detected you here, is that something that actually is an attack chain that we can look at or examine closely, where, for example, the password policy one that I mentioned. If I perform password policy or discover password policy, enumerate users, and then perform a password spray, that's an attack chain itself. And then a separate one would be credential dumping, and then all the way. That's how I would break them apart to be able to then report at least in totality of what we're actually examining. So in a given emulation plan, I may say, we're going to do 5 different test cases or these attack chains. Maybe it's specifically discovery, credential access, etc. And then that's going to be kind of the report in terms of how you did it in totality of the attack chain, and less so about the atomic procedure, if that makes sense. One thing about the EDR tool that I'll mention too is a lot of them actually can be enabled in audit mode, so they won't actually prevent things, because we're looking really to examine how detection is working, because that's going to be the sole factor, because you obviously can't prevent everything. But you can enable audit mode to then get the full data of what would actually happen. So if you're executing an attack chain and you stop there, that first step, maybe you can't get the full 5 different additional atomics, you can put it in audit mode to then see how the next iteration would go. Because we're really looking to cover as much as possible in the framework, at least that's aligned to the threat level. Hopefully that answers your question. Does anyone else have any questions? Go ahead.
I guess I have a more general question. For tactics and techniques, is there a vetting process for how they get added to this repository?
To the MITRE ATT&CK repository? Yeah, so it's mainly just publicly available threat intelligence. So the one that I referred to is Red Canary's detection report. That's an example where they're examining threat of breaches essentially, and they are looking at what an actual attacker is doing. And if we go to this example, where essentially the CrowdStrike would release a report of what an adversary actually did, and in that report you can start mapping techniques to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and that exercise is somewhat rigorous. So you'll see link to malicious site that downloads a Flash installer. That's maybe the only threat intelligence that's available, and then analysts are looking at that and then mapping it back to the attack framework. The other one, another good example is that fatigue. So that soft token that I was mentioning of the threat actor was just bombing this end user with alert authentication requests. That's a really good example because that wasn't observed up until now in public data, so it didn't exist until they actually observed it and put it into the matrix.
But there's no formal process just based on
It's all analysts, it's a community repo, so it's always being updated.
Anyone can contribute
Yeah.
on the attack website.
Yep. Any other? I think we're out of time, so. Cool. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch or ask me. I'll be around. But thank you.